Omnipotent, the Merciful, may his peace and blessings be upon our Holy Prophet and his progeny. Dear viewers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to the Convertsation. In this program, we discuss the issues, needs, and daily challenges faced by converts to the religion of Islam. Join me for another episode. My name is Daniel Pizer. I'm here with my co-host, Shaykh Yahya Seymour. And in this episode, the previous episode, we were talking about the issue of marriage. However, it's a very complex issue, and we didn't quite get all the way through it. So, inshallah, we'll continue to cover that topic today. When we left off, we were talking about pressure that new Muslims may face to marry early on, particularly in the case of sisters, and that this is sometimes promoted as the way that they can continue to learn their religion, and immediately may be met with a lot of other sisters who are well-meaning, trying to set them up with husbands, and talked about some of the problems with that, as well as some of the issues that convert men may face as well in terms of speaking with families and this kind of thing. Did you have anything else to add? Or?
Well, I think it's best that we allow the conversation to flow organically. On those particular topics, I think we could raise numerous issues, really. The culturalism one is something that we could probably span a whole episode out of. So, but were there any particular topics for the discussion today that you wanted to get off the top of your head?
Well, one of the things that I introduced in the last show that we didn't get to was the case of Muslims, new Muslims who either were married and converted, or perhaps had to divorce as a result of conversion, or who may have had to divorce, or perhaps were already separated from their spouses, who have children already.
No.
In particular, this can be, I suppose children would be a complicating factor for men as well, but I would imagine especially that would be the case.
Even more so for women, to some degree,
for
I
women,
believe.
certainly. So I kind of wanted to open that can of worms. It's a big one, so... I mean, I think one of the issues that we find anyway is that there's already a fair amount of stigma within communities surrounding the issue of divorce, which may or may not change in the next decade or so, as we see that, at least in the US, I'm not sure about the UK, but the numbers all indicate that divorce is rapidly becoming as prevalent within the Muslim community as it is outside of that.
Absolutely.
To give you some perspective, in the US, again, I don't know in the UK, but the divorce rate is usually mentioned at being around now slightly over 50%, somewhere between 51 and 54% maybe of marriages. In terms of new marriages, though, the divorce rate's substantially higher now. It's somewhere closer to 75% in many American states. So either way, whether or not the divorce rate within the Muslim community catches up with that, it certainly means that if we're talking about people potentially converting to or joining the religion, that the issue of divorcees is going to be something that is going to have to be dealt with one way or the other.
Of course. I begin in the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most beneficent, and I seek refuge in Him from the accursed Satan. And I ask Him to send His blessings upon Muhammad, His blessings upon him, and upon his holy progeny. And afterwards, I think it's crucial to dwell into that topic of divorce, for it is indeed an important topic. In regards to the divorce rate, I couldn't give an exact statistic off the top of my head. It's something I've looked up in the UK. But what I can say from merely the human experience and induction is that I can remember growing up and, well, whilst my parents had separated from a young age, they were not divorced because they're Catholics, and there's, of course, legal issues within the Catholic Church in regards to the issue of divorce. But I can remember being in a class in which there was maybe two people who were children of divorcees. Two, by the time I was leaving high school, namely the last year we do prior to going to university, sixth form, I found that I was in a class where maybe you now had half the students in the class were divorcees and parents had remarried. So certainly there has been a change in attitude over time. As morality in society has changed, it's become more of an acceptable thing to become divorced, especially when people get more distant from religiosity. I think that divorce becomes more socially acceptable. Although, one thing I'm keen to say here is that when we mention these things, we're talking about the fact that the West has traditionally come from the Judeo-Christian system.
Sure.
And particularly within the Christian church, most conservative and traditional Christians are of the opinion that the church marriage represents a blessed union which is symbolically representative of the union between the believers and God himself, or Christ according to them. And hence the consequences of divorce are much more severe according to Christian teachings than they are according to Islam. Now, one thing we do have to highlight here, just for those who would wish to bring this up, is that Islam does not necessarily have a positive view of divorce either. Of course, we have those riwayats which state that there is nothing more hated to Allah Azza wa Jal from those things which are mubah than the act of divorce.
Sure, that every divorce makes the throne of God shake.
Absolutely. Yet, we must, as Muslims, come to understand the actual meaning of these riwayat to some degree. What I mean is, we need to not merely try and find justification for our view on things from the riwayat, rather we need to try and read the riwayat and the scriptures of Islam holistically. And what I mean by that is, despite the fact that it is something so disliked by Allah Azza wa Jal, we cannot escape the reality that Allah Azza wa Jal himself in the Quran, in addressing two of the, I guess we could say, less pious wives of the Prophet, Allah Azza wa Jal himself says that you should, if they continue in such behavior, divorce them, and Allah will replace him with those who are better than them. Therefore, Allah Azza wa Jal recognizes the need in certain cases for a divorce to take place. More importantly, when we refer back to the, and I'm sure this is a controversial statement in and of itself, but for those who are confident in history and are familiar with our books of history, they will know this is the case. Some of the ma'asumeen themselves are people who separated from women they were married to. In the case of the Holy Prophet ﷺ specifically, we know there are women who he married, who an aqd was recited with, but later on did something silly or disturbing, such as accusing him of something or saying something negative to him, often encouraged by some of the less pious wives of the Prophet to do such, and as a result were divorced and separated from our Holy Prophet ﷺ. So we see that even within the pattern of the Ma'asumeen, there is a legitimate framework in which sometimes the benefits of a divorce outweigh the positivity of avoiding the act of divorce.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I think the community needs to indeed bear these things in mind. In regards to now the topic, which is the crux of our conversation now, can a convert who is either a divorcee, be they male or female, or even a widow, can they successfully remarry? And especially if they have, as you said, offspring or children from that marriage. I think if we are to be honest with ourselves, and I somewhat offer my condolences to the audience who are watching this for having to hear these words come from my mouth, but I don't believe they struggle in finding marriage if the marriage is temporary. I believe they struggle to find permanent spouses, and spouses who are willing to take them on under their wing, under their responsibility, over their shoulders, in light of the fact that they have children. And sometimes this is often the most primitive thing ever, because the person legitimately does not want anything to do with these children. And sadly, it's the children who are viewed as a burden by these people. When in reality, let's be quite honest here. Again, we see that this is nothing more than a divergence, a deviation, and a perversion of a prophetic sunnah.
I was just going to say, I mean, this seems to go directly against the sunnah, and we see the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him and his family, marrying divorced women.
Absolutely.
Clearly, I think it's sad that so long after his martyrdom that we still have this struggle in our communities. that people who are divorced, and I would imagine it's especially the case for women, although I have to say I was surprised to see how much it was the case for men, that that he's established a precedent for us that we've not taken to heart.
Absolutely. And this is really a controversial issue to bring up in the communities. And some people would rather run away from this discussion. But I believe that in the reality that we find ourselves in the fact that many women, not even just converts, even non-converts, born Muslim women, who were pressured into the wrong marriage by their parents as a result of what we were discussing yesterday, namely that public pressure for you to marry your cousin or someone of the same background, even though you share nothing in common with him, and perhaps he or she may be pursuing a better life in the West through marrying you, especially if you're coming directly from a Muslim country, in which the cultures contrast and conflict entirely. We find that such people are finding themselves as divorcees. Now they wish to remarry, and they're finding that people refuse to marry them on the basis that, oh no, look.
Well, they treat it as though this person had their one shot and essentially lost it. And in many cases, this may have been, again, prior to conversion, or worse, in some cases, this person may have had to divorce as a result of their conversion. And they're repaid with that by being treated by some community members as though they're defective.
Absolutely. And this is something we need to bear in mind, because it's not appreciating the crux of the issue. Even, as I said, if they're not a convert, even if it's a born Muslim female lady who has been forced or pressured, applied so much pressure that she felt the need to accept a marriage on behalf of her family, for example, then she ends up in a relationship with a culture clash, or even worse, may Allah forbid, an abusive marriage. Yeah. She seeks the need to liberate herself from that abusive marriage, and she finds herself as a divorcee. Now you're telling me that, look, your parents chose the wrong spouse for you, you've got the wrong parents, you've got the wrong marriage, you chose your life, it's over now. No. When in reality, let me just, as I said, I don't like to do this. I don't like to be forced to discuss issues which are sometimes controversial, but allow me to grab the bulls by the horn here, and allow me to make a special appeal to the audience in regards to the prophetic sunnah. And when we say the prophetic sunnah, I'm referring specifically to the personality of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Of course, the Imams alayhim assalam have given us different precedents to follow, and indeed we can find truth and righteousness in their precedents, but I'm also saying that if we're going to dismiss these things, then we have to also look at the Holy Prophet, and we wouldn't want our disgusting attitudes towards these things to bounce back onto the way he lived his life. When you look at the only woman who he married, who was someone who was not married before, according to some sources,
Sure.
we find that this woman is the one who Allah Azza wa Jal has directly condemned from above the seven heavens. And when I say that, I mean metaphorically. I don't believe Allah is physically sitting above seven heavens here. She is the one who Allah has condemned from above the seven heavens, and she is the one whom Allah Azza wa Jal stated, if she continues to rebel against you, then Allah will cause you to divorce her and replace her with better wives.
You mean in Surah Tahrim,
At-Tahrim,
and
Surah
also
66.
in the ayat, the Ifk?
In the ayat of Ifk, in which she had accused the innocent wife of a prophet, Maria al-Qibtiyya, the descendant of the Egyptian Coptics, of being someone who is promiscuous and had carried the child of a man other than Rasulullah. May Allah destroy the slanderers.
We have a few minutes before we go to break, and you brought up something I want to touch on before that, and inshallah, while we could spend a lot of time on it, maybe it's better not to, because there are some controversial issues we can touch on, and some I think maybe we need to devote separate time to. But additionally, when we talk about marriages in which there is some kind of abuse or domestic violence, and we don't mean to specify that this is something that's particular to the Muslim community. Certainly we see anyone who's fair-minded wants to look at statistics about this. This cuts across all communities. But what's more troubling to me is that the first course of action, many times, if a Muslima seeks istifta'at or something else, some kind of answer from a marja's office or other things, I have frequently seen from them or from communities the response to just sort of be patient, and hopefully that will improve. Now, I don't mean to completely contradict this. I understand the positive sentiment behind that and the desire to help someone change. But what I would say that I would feel negligent if I didn't point out in the last couple minutes before the break here is that the statistics around this are very disturbing in that they tend to point to one direction for this kind of behavior. And it's not to say that men who behave violently towards their partners, that they can't change this behavior. However, the statistics don't generally support that it's very easy to do, and in fact, usually that behavior escalates. So I think it's something that we at least have to mention that community leaders as well need to be aware of, that there is a liability that they're taking on their hands when they don't place the safety of the abused party first as the main priority, and that if separation or divorce, whichever, becomes necessary at some point, that we have to keep in mind that the safety of the human being is a sacrosanct thing, and that has to come before considerations, just like the fiqh principle that we have, the consideration of harm and wariness of that takes priority over benefit.
Of course. However, let the following be said by myself, and I know this is controversial, but a woman who finds herself in this situation and feels that social factors, be it that she's living in a country where this is not, she's unable to escape from this situation, or a woman that just realizes it's too late to do anything with the situation, and they die as a result of the abuse, then their position in Jannah is an extremely high one, and their husband is going to be one of the dwellers of hell, just as we know from the two daughters of the Holy Prophet who found themselves in an abusive marriage similarly, and both died as a result of that abusive marriage.
Inshallah, we're going to take a break now, and hopefully when we come back we can have some more positive content and ideally some kind of solutions to some of these problems. Thank you for joining us. Please stay tuned. Conversation. Thank you for joining us again. Once again, I'm Daniel Pizer. With me is my co-host, Shaikh Yahya. When we left off for the break, we were discussing the subject of marriage, which we'd also discussed during our previous program, and a rather serious topic came up, which had to do with domestic violence or abuse between partners in a marriage. And just so we don't leave that open without finishing touching on it, what I would say, as someone who's worked in counseling services, that if this is an ongoing issue that you have in your marriage, or it's something in your relationship that you need to seek help with, that I urge you to do that, and there are plenty of professional services available. I understand that in many cases for Muslims, anyone who's watching this, that there may be concerns about cultural sensitivity in counseling, and I would encourage you to take the leap anyway, that most therapists and counselors are trained in cultural sensitivity issues, and if it doesn't work out, you can always move on to another one. But the more important point, I guess, is safety first, and not being too afraid to reach out for help when it's available. If you look around in your communities, usually it's actually not that difficult to locate, even if you just pick up the phone book. And actually, in many instances, unfortunately not in all, but in many instances, the leaders in your community may also have connections to resources like that, or in some cases, even be licensed marriage counseling providers. So, was there anything you wanted to add to that before we continue?
Small divergence of opinion with you, Sheikhna, which is that whilst I agree with you entirely, I believe that our communities should actually be well equipped to deal with the problem of counseling and assisting such women who find themselves in such a situation. Why? Because the last thing we want is, yes, whilst I appreciate that the counselor is trained, they're an impartial person, and often they will have a degree of cultural sensitivity. Sadly, can we imagine the effects of numerous women who find themselves oppressed by their communities, unable to speak to our very own community leaders, and as a result have to seek refuge with non-Muslim counselors? As a result, I'm not concerned with the dimension of the counselor being non-Muslim. That's irrelevant to the point here. I'm more concerned with the fact that what kind of image of Islam is this going to be leaving with the counselor who's being told that this is the issue I find myself in. I go to the community leader of my religion and they're unable to offer assistance and tell me to merely be patient.
What I can tell you is it's not, in my own experience from counseling, it's not something that's anyone thinks is exclusive to one religion. And it's something that, as a profession, that we unfortunately deal with on a semi-regular basis, and in some cases, you know, this is people's sole job. I know also in metropolitan communities and large urban centers, there may actually be Muslim services or social services set up to deal specifically with these kinds of issues as well. On the other hand, I would also say that sometimes people are surprised to find that they're more comfortable speaking to someone who's outside of their own cultural and religious community about that particular issue, because it comes back to the somewhat judgmental attitude that they may fear around stigma surrounding not just divorce, but problems in a marriage in the first place, or other things like that.
This is a massive issue. I must admit, from my, and I'll be careful to say what institute this was, but at one of my previous jobs, we had a counselor. And I guess we could say job. One of my previous places of education or work, we had a counselor. And so we would often go to her as a confidential service and tell her everything that was going on that we needed help with, that were affecting our studies or our work. And one thing we found was her son was one of our peers. So we'd be sitting in class and sometimes he'd be like, oh yeah, because you were having an issue with this, right? And a couple of me and my friends and I, we observed this and we're kind of thinking, well, how do you know about this stuff? Then we kind of made the link, you know, son, counselor.
I'd like to think that kind of thing doesn't happen much.
Unfortunately, with our communities, there is a degree of lack of professionalism that we can only hope will be resolved in the next few years.
So, to steer it back to where we left off before we got onto this particular issue, when we talk about the stigma, I mean, let's take an imaginary example anyway and say that we have someone who either became divorced, if it was a Muslim sister, for instance, maybe she was married, and as a result of converting, now she's divorced. I think this is not as common of a situation, but it happens.
Yeah.
That someone has made a massive sacrifice right out of the gate for their faith, in a way that I think, unfortunately, a lot of community members or a lot of born Muslims may not, I mean, they're not asked to make these kinds of sacrifices. Yeah. I don't want to get into like a thing about everyone sacrifices, everyone has trials. I mean, obviously that's true.
That's a given.
But to sacrifice that much for faith itself, and then to have to deal with the stigma coming in, how can someone begin to deal with that, and more importantly, how can communities become more welcoming places? I mean, one of the things that I think about that could be useful, although it would need to start in a couple of communities and then see how it goes, is actually, if it were possible, to start meeting groups or things like that for divorcees in the community. Part of the process usually of integrating is raising awareness and destigmatizing, and that happens, we call the process normalization, and then we show that it's actually a fairly normal thing, and it's not something that people need to treat with a great deal of shame. But even myself, when I think about these issues, it's something that it saddens me a lot because I don't see a lot of communities equipped to deal with them.
Sure.
And it's not as though resources aren't available. There
No, of course not.
certainly
Of course
are. And there's even training in religious marriage counseling, other things like this.
As I've said, there is a degree of a stigma to attach to the Muslim community, particularly our Shia community, in which it's perceived as being extremely negative to be a divorcee. And it's almost taboo to even speak about. And so I would even fear that these kind of divorcee meetup groups would be, to some degree, opposed heavily by the community itself. And
It's a possibility.
Naturally, there are some concerns which I would naturally understand on behalf of the more Muslim community in regards to these kind of events. But as long as we could coordinate it in an Islamic fashion, I don't see what would be the problem.
Community itself, what can they do in terms of becoming more accepting? Is this something that has to happen from the top down in terms of leadership taking some level of initiative or responsibility for creating a more welcoming or non-judgmental atmosphere for divorcees, particularly those who are new Muslims? Or is this something that can only happen from the ground up in sort of a more
I personally
organic
find
way
that these
within
things happen
communities?
from the ground up, in the sense that the leader is often not someone who is elected due to his charisma and his ability to guide the community. Rather, he's elected because he knew before election, when he was running as a candidate, that you should be someone who has the qualities that the community wishes from you, and therefore sells himself and markets himself in the mold of the man that the community wants. And sometimes that's not even necessarily Islamic qualities. That's qualities pertaining to a particular cultural group. I can only speak from certain experiences that I've had in the UK particularly. In certain ethnic groups, this is the case. And so sometimes I feel that it would need to come from a grassroots level in which the leader, who is naturally merely the voice piece of the community, would be forced into a position and cornered into a position where he's going to start speaking about these things publicly.
And what about the issue of children, which makes it a bit stickier?
The issue of children, we know that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi, from his marriages to divorcees and widows, married women who had children. And he took these children under his care, under his wing, and they became as if they were his own children. In fact, we have certain companions, such as the son of Salama, who is a narrator that's narrated a lot about Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi. And he is someone that grew up under the community in which his mother was now married to Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi.
Here's where I'm going to challenge just a bit and say that there's a lot of prophetic examples that are set that people look to but don't follow, or they look to and they say, yeah, that's really nice, but he was the prophet. I mean, we have this on both sides,
But
right?
he's an infallible...
Right,
yeah.
we have it on first, it's on one side of this, it's if you do something that we're not in line with that, with the prophetic sunnah, then we'll say, oh, this isn't sunnah, you have to try to emulate the prophet, sallallahu alayhi wa alihi. Or, on the other hand, if you encourage someone to do this, then you're met with the excuse that they're an infallible, I can't be like that, come on. But the truth is, if we look in communities all around us, or just the normal, in my case, American society, people who are divorced and have children, they remarry all the time. And this doesn't seem to be nearly as much of an issue. Sure. Now, in some religious communities, non-Muslim religious communities, it may, in fact, be more of an issue.
Well, that's the ironic thing. I find that the Catholic Church has retained its stance on divorce, saying that it's something forbidden, according to the Church, which is perceived as the voice of God by that community. Yet at the same time, if we're to be honest amongst ourselves, we're both from Catholic backgrounds. Yeah. We know that despite the fact it's forbidden by the Church, divorces and remarriages successfully happen within the Catholic community better than they do within the Muslim Shia community, in which divorce is merely disliked and at times the only solution to liberation of the self.
So, in terms of converts who may be coming to the religion there's a question of what kind of advice that we can offer them, as well as also people who may be thinking about converting to the religion of Islam. If I put myself in the position of someone who is considering converting, and I was in this position where either I was married or I was already divorced, or I might have to divorce as a result of this because I knew my spouse wouldn't follow me into it. And I was looking into the religion, and I knew that I would face a lot of difficulty because of that. That might be something that would put me off. And this, of course, isn't limited to this particular issue. There are maybe other issues that converts face as well, whether it's the family struggles or other things. So I don't want to give the impression that it's all doom and gloom and that there's no, everything in your life will go to ruin if
there's
you
no
convert.
light at the end of the tunnel.
Right. Certainly, we all, and when I say we, at least in this case, I mean converts, face many struggles that are perhaps in addition to the struggles that someone who is born Muslim might face. But I certainly don't want to give the impression that this isn't a beautiful religion, that it's not a religion that has room for everybody. So for someone who may be thinking about converting, or maybe someone who's already converted, who's dealing with the issue of divorce, or has been divorced, and more importantly, would like to remarry, and this is becoming an issue for them, what can we offer them, whether it's in terms of advice or even just moral support and validation? I mean, the first thing I'll say, just to get it started, is maybe the first thing is validation, is in fact to say to them that you're not alone in this issue, that there is hopefully not a majority, but at least a silent minority who deal with these problems and who are facing similar struggles.
Sadly, this kind of tap on the back, I find, is not always the best approach to take. I sometimes think that if we are to be honest with ourselves and to be honest with these converts, we need to ensure that when they converted to this beautiful religion, which is al-Islam, and particularly the Islam of Ali Muhammad alayhi salam, they converted to it with the knowledge that Ali Muhammad and Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa in particular are the infallibles and the perfect guides. Therefore, there needs to be an immediate recognition and understanding that not everything that is done by the community is endorsed by Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa and Ali Muhammad alayhi salam. And as a result, we need to attempt to rectify the situation of a community. We need to inform the converts that, look, you will encounter difficulty. Unfortunately, our community has this backwards mindset. That backwards mindset is in complete contrast, opposition, and is a deviation from the teachings of Ali Muhammad. Absolutely. And your role models are Ali Muhammad. Now, do you want to go ahead with your conversion? I recommend you do, because you found the truth in Ali Muhammad. You've not found the truth in those who claim to follow Ali Muhammad. And for giving them such a wake-up call from the beginning, to some way you've already softened the blow that might come. See, I didn't have those softenings of blows when I first converted. I was under the impression I just saw the contrast eventually. And I had to learn the hard way too.
I guess if I could go back and I would think, is there anything someone could say to me early on that would be very helpful? That would probably be it, in fact, is to remind them that they're converting to the religion and not the community of believers. Yeah. Inshallah, the community of believers will change, and they can be a part of that change and improvement. But that if you're doing it, that it's not to confuse the religion with the follower. Yeah. It's in fact still something I have to remind my parents of sometimes.
Well, it's sometimes based upon the fact that we human beings don't like to judge things or define things based on abstracts. We like to find practical examples of everything, which is part of the main problem you get now in the media with the whole "is Islam a religion of violence" thing, where people were saying to you, well, look, you've got these guys who are violent, they're reading the Quran too, so surely we can judge this as a violent faith. Or even people like Irshad Manji, who is a Khoja, so-called ex-Muslim, even though she was not from a religious family, and admits that her father used to beat her and drink. who says that Islam is defined based on what Muslims do. Now, when we're working with such definitions, it's no wonder that we're going to write books like The Problems of Islam, because we can find any crackhead, homeless person from the street who says, I'm a Muslim, and goes around stabbing individuals, and go, look, now we can write a book called The Problem of Islam and write about this poor man's life story.
Sure. Unfortunately, we obviously see a double standard there in the sense that other communities are not judged in the same way.
Of course.
But absolutely.
But no, in regards to people like your mother, I can understand the approach they take. And I wish that in the future we can point to a substantial amount of people who actually do embody the prophetic definition of what Islam is.
Well, we only have a few minutes left, unfortunately, in this broadcast. So I guess in terms of my own final parting thoughts, and then please feel free to add yours, I would say that for the most part, after converting, especially if you are someone who is divorced or is coming from any other kind of background where you're going to run into the kind of struggles and challenges that we've mentioned on the show, not just in this episode, but in prior broadcasts, to know that on one hand, some of those challenges will get more intense, and on the other hand, that some of those challenges may lighten over time, and that ultimately, there's one narration, I wish that I had it on hand. Maybe I do, let me see. Yeah. It's one from Imam al-Askari, he says that every single ordeal contains a favor from God that encompasses it. And sometimes the trick can be to look for the favor. Inshallah, we can come back with some more practical advice, but there's not always a lot of practical advice, I think.
Sometimes, as you said, that narration is particularly beautiful from Imam al-Askari alayhi salam. And sometimes, we believe that God is the all-knowing and He's the most gracious and the most merciful. We just have to trust that there was some kind of wisdom and hikmah behind the trials and tribulations that the converts have had to face in these recent days. And also, that's not to suggest we take a very kind of apathetic attitude towards the situation and really sit back and say, that's how it is, there's blessings in the suffering. No, that's not what I'm trying to do here. I'm suggesting that we also try and rectify the situation. And I believe that this situation is merely one which highlights the fact that we have drifted so far away from the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wa sallam and his prophetic sunnah. And even as I said in last week's episode, I believe that it also highlights the need for us to return to a prophetic model of how Islam is.
Absolutely.
In order to rectify all these problems.
If we accept that Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam are the ark of salvation, we got to get on the boat.
Absolutely.
Thank you for joining us again for another episode of The Convertsation. Inshallah, you will join us in the future, and our contact information has been posted on screen, and thank you again for joining us. May God's peace and blessings continue to be upon His holy prophet and his progeny. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.